Logan Carter didn't have time for distractions. He barely had time to breathe. Between running his architecture firm and raising his 5-year-old daughter, Sophie, on his own, his life was a carefully structured blur of meetings, deadlines, and bedtime stories. He needed help, not complications. So when Grace Sullivan walked into his home for the nanny interview, the last thing he expected was for his world to tilt on its axis. She wasn't what he had pictured. He had imagined someone older, someone practical, a no-nonsense, experienced caretaker. Instead, Grace was young, with warm brown eyes, a soft smile, and an energy that filled the room like sunlight spilling through the windows. She was wearing jeans and a simple lavender sweater, her long dark hair pulled into a loose ponytail that kept slipping over her shoulder. "This is Sophie," Logan said, clearing his throat, trying to suppress the sudden awareness that prickled at the back of his neck. "She's 5, smart, stubborn. Loves dinosaurs and bedtime stories." Grace knelt in front of Sophie, her expression open and kind. "Dinosaurs, huh? What's your favorite?" Sophie hesitated, her small fingers clutching the edge of her dress. "T-Rex," Grace gasped, her eyes wide with exaggerated excitement. "No way, that's my favorite too." "Do you think they were really that scary?" Sophie's lips twitched, and Logan nearly dropped his coffee cup. His daughter was shy around new people, hesitant and reserved. But something about Grace made Sophie relax almost instantly. Logan leaned against the kitchen counter, arms crossed. "You seem good with kids." Grace stood and met his gaze, her expression confident but unreadable. "I've been a nanny for 4 years. I love it. Kids are honest. You always know where you stand with them." That was more than Logan could say for most adults. He exhaled sharply and ran a hand through his hair. "You'll be here Monday through Friday, 8 to 6, sometimes later if work runs over." Grace nodded. "Got it." He hesitated. There was something about her, something that unsettled him. He couldn't put his finger on it, but he ignored the feeling, pushing through the details of the job. This was just business. He needed help, and she was the best candidate he had interviewed. "Can you start Monday?" he asked, his voice firm, professional. Grace's lips curled into a smile, one that made his stomach tighten in a way it had no business doing. "Absolutely." By Wednesday, Logan knew hiring Grace had been the right decision. Sophie adored her. Every evening when he came home, he found his daughter happier, chattier, more engaged. But what he hadn't accounted for was how much he would notice Grace too. It was the way she hummed while making Sophie's snacks, the way she curled up on the couch to read bedtime stories, completely lost in the words as Sophie leaned against her. It was the way she filled his home with warmth, a stark contrast to the quiet, structured life he had built. One evening, he walked in to find them dancing in the living room, Sophie giggling as Grace twirled her around. The sight hit him harder than it should have. "You're home early," Grace said breathlessly, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. Logan swallowed and nodded. "Yeah." "Finished work sooner than expected." Sophie ran over, her face alight with excitement. "Daddy, Grace taught me how to twirl." "Watch," he forced a smile, trying to ignore the way Grace's eyes lingered on him. "Show me, sweetheart." As Sophie spun, Grace stepped back, giving them space. Logan's gaze flickered to her, and for a moment they just stood there, the air between them shifting. He needed to stop this, whatever this was. She was Sophie's nanny, nothing more. But as the days passed, Logan found himself looking forward to coming home, to hearing Grace's laughter echo through his house. He told himself it was just because she was good for Sophie. That was all. Then, one evening, he walked into the kitchen to find Grace struggling to open a jar of pasta sauce, her brow furrowed. Without thinking, he crossed the space between them, gently taking the jar from her hands. Their fingers brushed, and she sucked in a breath. Logan twisted the lid open effortlessly, but the moment stretched between them, thick with something unspoken. "Thanks," she murmured, her voice softer than usual. He should have stepped away. Should have put distance between them. Instead, he found himself lingering, his eyes dropping to her lips before he caught himself. This was dangerous. He cleared his throat and stepped back. No problem. Grace hesitated, then turned back to the stove, but he could feel the tension crackling in the air. Logan knew he was playing with fire. But for the first time in years, he wasn't sure he wanted to put it out. Logan tried to ignore it. The way his pulse kicked up when he walked into the house and heard Grace's voice, the way his gaze sought her out before anything else. It was a problem, a complication he couldn't afford. But it didn't stop. One evening, he arrived home later than usual. The house was quieter than normal, the soft hum of music playing from the living room. He set his keys down and moved toward the sound, stopping in the doorway. Grace was curled up on the couch with Sophie, reading a book. His daughter's head rested against her shoulder, her small fingers gripping the edge of the page. He should have walked away, should have gone to his office and buried himself in work like he always did. Instead, he stood there, watching. Grace's voice was soft, melodic, her expression completely absorbed in the story she was telling. It wasn't just the words, it was the way she made them come alive. Sophie hung on every sentence, her tiny face lighting up at the dramatic parts, her body tensing at the suspenseful ones. And Logan felt something shift inside him. Grace glanced up and spotted him. A small smile tugged at the corners of her lips, but she didn't stop reading. He swallowed, nodding slightly before turning away, heading toward the kitchen. It wasn't just attraction, that he could have ignored. It was the way she fit so perfectly into their lives, and it terrified him. The next morning, Logan forced himself to focus on work. He had a million things to do, deadlines to meet, clients to deal with. But even in his office, his mind kept drifting back to the way Grace had looked last night, curled up with Sophie, her expression open and warm. He needed to put distance between them. So he started staying later at work, pushing himself harder, making sure he was exhausted by the time he got home. It didn't help. Because every night, no matter how late he walked in, Grace was still there. One evening, he found her in the kitchen, humming softly as she washed dishes. She was wearing one of her usual soft sweaters, her dark hair pulled up loosely. She glanced over her shoulder when she saw him, giving him a small smile. "You're working too hard," she said lightly. "Sophie misses you." Logan exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "I know, it's just, work's been hectic." Grace nodded, drying her hands on a towel. "You should take a break." "Even just a small one." He hesitated, then shook his head. "I can't afford to." She studied him for a moment, her gaze unreadable. "Sometimes, the things we think we can't afford are the things we need most." Logan clenched his jaw, something tightening in his chest. "It's not that simple." Grace tilted her head slightly. "Maybe it is." He didn't have an answer for that, so he did what he always did, he shut it down. But later, after he had gone to bed, her words echoed in his head. The next day, he came home earlier on purpose. Sophie was in the backyard, playing in the sandpit Grace had set up for her. When she saw him, her whole face lit up. "Daddy!" Logan barely had time to brace himself before she launched into his arms. He caught her easily, holding her close as something inside him cracked. "I missed you," she murmured against his shoulder. Guilt settled deep in his chest. He had been so focused on running from whatever was happening with Grace that he had been neglecting what mattered most. "I missed you too, sweetheart," he whispered, pressing a kiss to her hair. Grace stood a few feet away, watching them with a soft expression. When his eyes met hers, something unspoken passed between them. That night, after Sophie had gone to bed, Logan found Grace in the kitchen again. He leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "You were right." She raised an eyebrow. "About what?" he exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "About needing to take a break, about being present." A small smile played at her lips. "I won't say I told you so." He huffed out a laugh, shaking his head. "Good." The silence stretched between them, thick with something he wasn't ready to name, but he wasn't running anymore. And that was a start. Logan should have known better. He should have known that letting Grace in letting her get close was dangerous. But somehow, she had slipped through the cracks in his carefully constructed walls. And now he couldn't stop thinking about her. It was in the small moments. When she laughed with Sophie over breakfast, when she tied her hair up absent-mindedly while reading a bedtime story, when she hummed softly while making dinner. And worst of all, it was in the way she looked at him. Like she saw through the version of himself he showed the world, like she wasn't intimidated by the weight he carried. Logan had spent years keeping his distance from anything that felt messy, from anything that could hurt. But Grace wasn't something he could ignore. One evening, he got home later than usual, but instead of finding Grace in the kitchen or reading with Sophie, he found her by the front door, slipping on her coat. "You're leaving," the words came out sharper than he intended. Grace paused, her fingers stilling on the buttons of her coat. "Yeah, I was just heading out," Logan frowned. "Where?" She arched an eyebrow, her expression amused. "Do you need a full itinerary of my personal life now?" He clenched his jaw, realizing how possessive he sounded. "That's not what I meant." "Then what did you mean?" He didn't have a good answer. Grace sighed, softening slightly. "I have a life outside of this house, Logan. A friend invited me out for dinner and I said yes." The thought of her out with someone who wasn't him settled uncomfortably in his chest. It wasn't his place to question her, but that didn't stop the jealousy from creeping in. "Right," he said, forcing his voice to stay neutral. "Have fun." Her eyes searched his face as if she was waiting for him to say something else, but he didn't, because what could he say? That he didn't want her to go. That the idea of her with someone else made his stomach twist. She gave him a small smile before stepping out the door. It should have been the end of it. But it wasn't. Logan spent the rest of the night restless, pacing his office, trying to focus on work and failing miserably. He checked the time too often, wondering if she was still out, if she was with someone. And when he finally heard the front door open just past midnight, his body tensed involuntarily. He waited a beat before stepping out of his office. Grace was hanging up her coat, her back to him. "You're back late," he said before he could stop himself. She turned, startled. "You're still up." Logan leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "Couldn't sleep." Grace hesitated, then nodded. "It was a nice night, good to catch up with friends." Something about the way she said it made his jaw tighten. "Anyone special?" Her lips parted slightly in surprise, and for a moment she didn't answer. Then, slowly, she said, "Why do you ask?" Logan exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "Forget it." But she didn't. She stepped closer, her gaze steady on his. "Logan." His name on her lips sent a shiver down his spine. "You don't get to look at me like that and then pretend it doesn't mean anything," she said softly. His throat went dry. "Like what?" Grace let out a quiet breath, shaking her head. "Like you want me to stay." A muscle in his jaw twitched. She stepped even closer, close enough that he could smell the faint trace of vanilla on her skin. "If you don't want this, tell me now." Logan should have walked away, should have ended this before it got too complicated. But he didn't. Instead, he reached out, his fingers brushing against her wrist, barely touching, but enough to make her inhale sharply. Enough to make everything between them crackle with tension. "I don't know how to want you and not ruin everything," he admitted, his voice raw. Grace's breath hitched. "Then maybe we stop pretending." Logan exhaled shakily, his pulse pounding in his ears. And then, before he could think better of it, he closed the distance between them. Logan didn't know who moved first. 1 second, the air between them was thick with tension, the kind that threatened to snap at the slightest provocation. The next, his hands were in her hair, his lips crashing against hers in a way that felt reckless, consuming. Grace gasped against his mouth, her fingers curling into the front of his shirt as if she needed to hold onto something solid. He kissed her like he'd been starving for her, like he hadn't spent the last few weeks trying and failing to pretend this wasn't inevitable. It was supposed to be a mistake. But it didn't feel like one. Her body pressed against his, soft and warm, fitting against him in a way that made his pulse hammer. He deepened the kiss, his grip tightening at her waist, pulling her closer, swallowing the small sound she made at the contact, and then a noise from upstairs. Both of them froze. Logan's breathing was ragged as he forced himself to pull back, his forehead resting against hers. Grace's eyes were wide, her lips red and swollen from his kiss. Reality crashed down on him like a wave. Sophie. This wasn't just about him. Grace must have seen the shift in his expression, because she took a step back, wrapping her arms around herself as if bracing for impact. "I should go to bed," she murmured, her voice unsteady. Logan's jaw clenched. He wanted to reach for her, wanted to pull her back against him and forget the world outside of this moment. But that wasn't an option. Not when his daughter was asleep upstairs, not when this could change everything. He nodded stiffly. "Yeah. That's probably best." Grace hesitated for a second, just long enough for him to see the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. And then, without another word, she turned and walked away. Logan stood there long after she was gone, his hands clenched at his sides, his body still burning from her touch. What the hell had he just done? The next morning, things were different. Not in an obvious way. Grace still made breakfast for Sophie, still smiled as she packed her lunch, still hummed softly under her breath as she moved around the kitchen. But she wouldn't look at him, not directly, not like before, and Logan hated it. He sat at the counter, watching as she helped Sophie tie her shoes, her movements smooth and practiced. She was acting as if last night hadn't happened, as if he hadn't kissed her like a man on the edge of losing control, as if she wasn't still on his mind. Sophie beamed up at Grace. "Can we go to the park today?" Grace glanced at Logan briefly, fleetingly as if seeking permission. It felt wrong. Like they had been pushed back into the roles they were supposed to play, as if the lines between them hadn't already blurred. Logan cleared his throat. "Yeah. That sounds like a good idea," Sophie cheered, grabbing Grace's hand and tugging her toward the door. Grace hesitated for the briefest second before following, and Logan let her go. The silence stretched between them for days, not in an obvious way, not in a way Sophie would notice, but in the moments in between. The moments where they used to steal glances across the room. The moments where Logan would find himself standing closer to her than necessary. The moments where it felt like something was building between them, something neither of them wanted to stop. Now, those moments were gone, and he hated every second of it. By the time Friday rolled around, Logan was at his breaking point. He found her in the kitchen after Sophie had gone to bed, wiping down the counters with slow, methodical movements. "Grace." She stiffened slightly but didn't turn around. "Logan." The distance in her voice made his stomach twist. He exhaled sharply. "We need to talk." She set the cloth down, finally turning to face him. Her expression was calm, guarded. "About what?" Logan clenched his jaw. "Don't do that." "Don't pretend like nothing happened." Grace let out a quiet breath, crossing her arms. "I'm not pretending, I don't know what you want me to say." He took a step closer, his pulse quickening. "Say that you felt it too." Her lips parted slightly, a flicker of emotion flashing across her face before she shut it down. "Of course I felt it." Logan's chest tightened. "Then why are you acting like it didn't mean anything?" Grace swallowed hard. "Because it can't mean anything." His hands curled into fists at his sides. "Why not?" She let out a shaky laugh, shaking her head. "Logan, you're my boss, and more importantly, I love Sophie. I won't do anything to mess that up. She's the priority here, not whatever this is between us." Logan exhaled harshly, dragging a hand through his hair. "You think I don't know that? That I don't think about her first in everything I do?" Grace's expression softened. "Then you know we can't do this." Logan took another step forward, closing the space between them. She didn't move away, didn't step back. "I know that I don't want to pretend you don't matter," he said quietly. "And I know that I haven't been able to stop thinking about you since the moment you walked into this house." Grace sucked in a sharp breath, her fingers tightening around the edge of the counter. Logan reached out, his fingers brushing against her wrist, a small, fleeting touch. "Tell me you don't want this," he murmured. "Tell me you don't feel it too, and I'll let it go." Grace's breathing was uneven, her pulse hammering beneath his fingertips, but she didn't say anything, because they both knew the truth. Whatever was between them, it wasn't something they could just ignore. And it was only a matter of time before it consumed them both. Grace didn't pull away. That was all the confirmation Logan needed. His fingers curled around her wrist, feeling the rapid beat of her pulse beneath his fingertips. Her breath hitched, the space between them charged with something electric, something undeniable. "You're not saying it," he murmured, his voice rough. "You're not telling me to stop." Grace's lips parted slightly, her eyes locked onto his. "Because I don't want you to." The admission was like a spark to dry kindling. Logan exhaled sharply, his control fraying at the edges. He reached up, cupping her face with careful hands as if afraid she might disappear. "Then tell me what you do want." Grace let out a shaky breath. "You." He didn't hesitate. He closed the distance between them, capturing her lips in a kiss that was long overdue. It wasn't hesitant or unsure, it was deep, consuming, filled with all the tension that had been simmering between them for weeks. Grace melted into him, her fingers gripping the front of his shirt as if anchoring herself. Logan tilted his head, deepening the kiss, tasting the soft sigh that escaped her lips. He had never felt anything like this before, this desperate, aching need to be closer, to lose himself in her. But then a sound from the hallway. They broke apart instantly, breathing heavily. "Sophie." Logan stepped back, running a hand over his face as reality crashed down on them. Grace's expression mirrored his, her eyes wide, her lips still parted from the kiss, her cheeks flushed. She opened her mouth to speak, but Logan shook his head. "We can't." "I know," she whispered, wrapping her arms around herself. "I know." They stood there for a long moment, the space between them suddenly filled with uncertainty. And then, without another word, Grace turned and walked away. The next few days were a mess of mixed signals and stolen glances. Logan wanted her. That much was undeniable, but wanting her and being able to have her were two very different things. Sophie was his world, and Grace had become part of that world in a way he hadn't anticipated. She wasn't just a nanny. She was the person who made Sophie laugh first thing in the morning. The one who sat with her on the floor, patiently listening as she explained the difference between a triceratops and a stegosaurus. The one who had somehow become the missing piece in their lives. And Logan was terrified of ruining that. One evening, he found her in the backyard after Sophie had gone to bed. She was sitting on the porch steps, staring up at the sky, lost in thought. He hesitated before stepping outside, closing the door behind him. "Couldn't sleep." Grace glanced at him but didn't smile. "Not really." Logan sat beside her, leaving just enough space between them to remind himself of the boundaries they were supposed to keep. The night air was cool, the faint hum of crickets filling the silence. "I don't regret it," he said finally. Grace let out a soft breath, tilting her head slightly to look at him. "The kiss," he nodded. "Any of it." She was quiet for a moment, then softly she said, "Neither do I." Logan turned to face her fully, his knee brushing against hers. "Then why does it feel like we're pretending it didn't happen?" Grace exhaled, rubbing her arms as if trying to ward off a chill. "Because we don't know what happens next." He studied her, his gaze searching. "What do you want to happen next?" Her lips curved slightly, but there was sadness in her eyes. "I want this to be easy." Logan huffed out a quiet laugh. "Yeah, me too." Grace looked down at her hands, "But it's not." "No." Logan reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "But that doesn't mean it's not worth it." She looked up, her expression unreadable. "What if it doesn't work? What if we make things complicated and Sophie gets caught in the middle?" Logan finished for her. Grace nodded. Logan tightened his grip on her hand. "I don't take risks, Grace. Not with my daughter, not with my life. But this," he gestured between them, his voice steady, "this is the one thing that feels like a risk I need to take." Grace's breath hitched. "Logan, I don't have the answers," he admitted. "But I know I don't want to spend another day pretending you don't mean something to me." Her lips parted, her eyes shining with something he couldn't quite name. And then, finally, she whispered, "Okay." Logan exhaled, relief washing over him. It wasn't a perfect answer, but it was a start. Logan had never been a man who let his emotions dictate his actions. He had spent years keeping everything in order, making decisions based on logic, not impulse. But as he stood in the kitchen watching Grace laugh softly at something Sophie said, he realized something. He didn't want to live his life in careful, measured steps anymore. Not when it came to her. It had been a week since that night on the porch. A week since they had finally admitted what had been simmering between them for months. And despite the risks, despite the fear of what it could mean, Logan had never been more certain about anything. He wanted Grace, not just in stolen moments and secret glances. He wanted her in his life, fully, completely, and he wasn't going to waste another second pretending otherwise. That night, after Sophie was asleep, he found Grace in the living room, curled up on the couch with a book. She looked up when she heard him, her expression soft but questioning. "Hey," she murmured. Logan didn't hesitate. He crossed the room, sat down beside her, and took her hands in his. Grace blinked in surprise. "Logan," he exhaled, searching her face. "I love you." Her breath hitched, her fingers tightening around his. "I know this is complicated," he continued, his voice steady. "I know we didn't plan for this, but I love you, Grace. And I don't want to waste any more time pretending I don't." Grace's lips parted, her eyes shining with something he couldn't quite name. Then suddenly, she let out a breathless, almost disbelieving laugh. "You're really bad at taking things slow, aren't you?" Logan smiled, brushing his thumb over the back of her hand. "Not when I know what I want." Grace swallowed hard, her gaze locked onto his. "And what do you want?" He cupped her face, his touch gentle but firm. "You, in my life, in Sophie's life." "For real?" For a moment, she didn't say anything. Then, slowly, she reached up, pressing her palm over his. "I love you too," she whispered. Logan exhaled sharply, as if he had been holding his breath. Then, without another word, he pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly against him. She melted into him, her face buried in his chest, her body fitting against his as if she had always belonged there. And maybe she had. Maybe this was always meant to happen. When she pulled back just enough to look at him, Logan didn't waste another second. He kissed her slow and deep, pouring everything he felt into it. When they finally broke apart, Grace sighed against his lips. "Are you sure about this?" Logan smiled, resting his forehead against hers. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." And as she curled into his arms, her heartbeat steady against his, Logan knew one thing for certain: this was home. And he was never letting it go.